Hello, my name is Allison Gill. You know me probably as AG or Mueller, She Wrote, and this is the first episode ever of my first ever video podcast. So, I've been doing audio podcasts in politics for 7 years, 8 years, something like that. And we know the authoritarians, the oligarchs like to flood the zone with shit. So I swim through it so you don't have to. And I grab all the headlines. I think we covered like 55 headlines this week across 8 different shows. And I thought I would really like to put together a video podcast. It's time to do a video podcast. And so what do you do when you want to do a video podcast? You call your friends at Midas Touch. So I called up the Midas guys. I was like, Midas, let's do a video pod. They said, why not? I said, why not? Pretty soon the whole group said, why not? So here we are. I said, I got all these headlines in my head at the end of the week. And we know that these headlines, these sound bites don't live in a vacuum. They aren't mutually exclusive from one another. They're all connected. So I thought I would do a quick show at the end of the week to wrap it all up, smush it all together, put it in context, curate the news, and give you like a 50,000-foot breakdown of everything that went on in the week. And so that's what this is. So without further ado, for the week ending September 7th, 2025, this is the breakdown. All right, so this week, several courageous, amazing, wonderful survivors of Jeffrey Epstein, if you notice, the New York Times likes to call him a financier and not a child-raping, sex-trafficking money launderer. These amazing women stood up and spoke out in favor of passing a congressional discharge petition to release the full unredacted Epstein files. Now, Donald Trump, innocent as he is, who appears several times in the Epstein files, by the way, made multiple threatening phone calls to House Republicans, telling them that if they vote for this discharge petition, it would be considered a hostile act against him. But if he's innocent, the release wouldn't be a hostile act. It would exonerate him. So he also scheduled a military flyover smack dab in the middle of the survivors' press conference to keep them quiet.
It had already happened. This woman abused children. I was abused by Jeffrey Epstein and Gill Maxwell for over 10 years.
Now, as a survivor who was steamrolled when I tried to report my rape, I can't think of a more fitting metaphor than a rapist spending millions of our taxpayer dollars to create loud noises as survivors try to tell their stories. But nevertheless, as the saying goes, she persisted. And also this week, I had a discussion on Substack with Mike Nellis, who's amazing. And someone asked us whether the Epstein files saga is a distraction from the authoritarian takeover of America by the ruling class. And while I appreciate the question, because it's hard to distinguish between noise and news these days when they flood the zone with shit, like I said, I contend that the Epstein files and the ruling class are inextricably linked. Whether the ultra-wealthy are exploiting our bodies for labor at poverty-level wages, or exploiting our bodies for rape in a multinational sex trafficking scheme and money laundering scheme to retain power, it's still the ruling class controlling our bodies. And this is true whether the oligarchs are running corporate conglomerates, sitting in the Oval Office, or donning a robe and occupying seats on the Supreme Court. And speaking of that, this week, as the Witch King of Angmar and his 5 ring wraiths continue to wreak havoc on the shadow docket, some lower court judges are actually speaking out, very rarely, by the way. A dozen or so told NBC News this week that the Supreme Court cannot keep overturning their well-researched rulings with little to no explanation. The Supreme Court's terse and unexplained decisions are doing nothing more, quote, than validating the Trump administration's unfounded attacks on the judiciary as a whole, which have led to an explosion of threats against the courts and judges and their staff. And John Roberts himself spoke out this past March about right-wing attacks against judges, as if to say, I never thought the leopards would eat my judiciary. But I hate to tell you this, John, but you're the one who crowned him king. It should not come as a surprise to you when you get whacked upside the head with his crown. And if you really want to restore faith in the judiciary, stop lifting injunctions against this administration without explanation. Maybe you can start with a case you'll decide soon about unaccompanied Venezuelan children that Trump tried to disappear in the middle of the night on Labor Day weekend before Judge Sparkle Suknanen grounded the planes and ordered the children back into the care of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Or a case about the Alien Enemies Act, that will be coming back to you, Mr. John Roberts, after you sent it back down to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and they said, this isn't a Denny's, we're not open 24/7. But this week, that ultra-conservative Fifth Circuit became the first appeals court to join several lower court judges' rulings that Trump's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act is unlawful. You'll recall last March, once again in the dead of night, Trump loaded some 250 men onto planes bound for the Seacoast torture prison. And that's when Judge Boasberg ordered the planes turned around. Now, according to whistleblower Erez Ruveni, who was later fired from the DOJ, Emil Bovey instructed him and other DOJ lawyers to just tell the courts to fuck off. Criminal contempt over defying that court order is still being litigated, but multiple judges says Trump can't use the Alien Enemies Act to deport people because we aren't at war. It's a wartime statute. And although we have gang members here in the U.S., sure, it's not a predatory incursion or an invasion on behalf of a foreign government. But the Fifth Circuit this week, they agreed that it's not an invasion. Judge Oldham said, today, the majority holds that President Trump is just an ordinary civil litigant. His declaration of a predatory incursion is not conclusive. It's far from it. Rather, Trump must plead sufficient facts, just like he were some run-of-the-mill plaintiff in a breach of contract case, and convince a federal judge that he's entitled to relief. Now, I would hope the Supreme Court will eventually agree and include a sufficient explanation as to why, because if the courts conclude that there is an incursion or an invasion, then Trump will be able to use the Alien Enemies Act to justify mass deportation and mass incarceration in internment and concentration camps. So let's say you're an evil dictator and you want to throw any and all brown people into internment camps or render them to torture prisons or third countries overseas. What do you do when it looks like the courts might be about to tell you that you can't use the Alien Enemies Act because there's no incursion and we're not at war and there's no Tren de Aragua predatory invasion on behalf of the Venezuelan government? What do you do? Maybe you start a war. Maybe you blow up a boat, probably of migrants that you claim was filled with Tren de Aragua traffickers that claim it was part of a predatory incursion, and maybe use that as pretext. The New York Times reported this week the Trump administration declared the start of a new and potentially violent campaign against Venezuelan cartels on Wednesday, defending a deadly U.S. military strike on a boat that officials said was carrying drugs, narco traffickers. On Tuesday, Mr. Trump said on social media that the 11 members of they were 11 members of Tren de Aragua, and they were killed in the strike. So you think, but only Congress can declare war, right? Yeah, but not for the purposes of the Alien Enemies Act. The Brennan Center for Justice says the president may invoke the Alien Enemies Act in times of declared war or when a foreign government threatens or undertakes an invasion or predatory incursion against the U.S. territory. The Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to declare war, so the president has to wait for democratic debate and a congressional vote to invoke the Alien Enemies Act based on a declared war. But the president need not wait for Congress to invoke the law based on a threatened or ongoing invasion or predatory incursion. The president has inherent authority to repel these kinds of sudden attacks, an authority that necessarily implies the discretion to decide when an invasion or a predatory incursion is underway. Or, if you're an evil president, maybe you provoke a war by blowing up a boat full of Venezuelan migrants. After Pete Hegseth's clearly unlawful attack on the boat, Venezuela scrambled jet fighters and did a flyover of Navy ships in the region. And Friday, the U.S. sent F-35 stealth fighter jets to Puerto Rico. Wag the dog much? So maybe he's trying to get Congress to declare war against the cartels by provoking one himself with his new Department of War. Because after all, if we're at war, maybe he can suspend elections. You know, Trump recently told Zelensky during a joint press conference, so you say during the war, you can't have elections, say 3.5 years from now. So you mean if we happen to be at war with somebody, no more elections? Now, of course, we've had a few wars here in the United States, and we've never postponed elections because of them. And Trump would probably have a hard time legally getting permission to suspend elections on non-existing precedent, even from the ring wraiths. But maybe you don't need to postpone the elections. Maybe you just need a reason to post up National Guard troops at polling sites to scare people and suppress the vote. Maybe he wants to use a military conflict as a pretext to invoke the Insurrection Act. Stephen Miller seems to really like that idea. And Trump fired Secretary of Defense Mark Esper during his first term because he wasn't keen on using the Insurrection Act. That was ahead of January 6th, by the way. And the Insurrection Act is the only way Trump can suspend posse comitatus. That's the statute that California Judge Stephen Breyer cited, preventing Trump from deploying the military to carry out law enforcement activities against citizens. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, quote, troops can be deployed under 3 sections of the Insurrection Act. Each of these sections is designed for a different set of situations. Unfortunately, the law's requirements are poorly explained and leave virtually everything up to the discretion of the president. We've been in need of reform of the Insurrection Act for a long time. They go on to say Section 251 allows Trump to deploy troops to tamp down an insurrection in a state, but requires the state's approval. So that's out. But Sections 252 and 253 actually allow the president to deploy troops without a request from the state, even against the state's wishes. Section 253 itself has 2 parts. The first allows the president to use the military in any state to suppress, quote, any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy that, quote, so hinders the execution of the laws that any portion of the state's inhabitants are deprived of a constitutional right and state authorities are unable or unwilling to protect that right, like voting. The second part of 253 permits the president to deploy troops to suppress, quote, any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy in a state that, quote, opposes or obstructs the execution of laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws. That provision is so bafflingly broad that it cannot possibly mean what it says. Otherwise, it authorizes the president to use the military against any 2 people conspiring to break federal law. Now, the good news is there's a law against sending troops to polling places, as Joyce Vance points out in her amazing Substack called Civil Discourse. It's Title 18, U.S. Code Section 592, and it explicitly prohibits any U.S. civil, military, or naval officer from bringing, keeping, or having control of troops or armed men at any polling place during an election, unless such force be necessary to repel armed enemies of the United States. Now, many of these questions resurfaced this week as Trump announced he'd be sending National Guard troops to Illinois, maybe from Texas. But because of Judge Breyer's decision in California that most of the stuff that Trump wants to do with the troops is barred by the Posse Comitatus Act, Trump seems to be rethinking his strategy. See, Illinois is a blue state. They have a Democratic attorney general that would swiftly sue this Trump administration if he tried to send unfederalized and unwelcome National Guard troops to Illinois. But what if he sent them to blue cities in red states, where the attorney general wouldn't try to stop him? Do we go to Chicago, or do we go to a place like New Orleans, where we have a great governor, Jeff Landry, who wants us to come in and straighten out a very nice section of his country that's become quite tough, quite bad? So we've had to overcome voter suppression before, but now it's on steroids. We've had voter ID laws, gerrymandering, attacks on vote by mail, now laying the groundwork for possibly stationing troops at polling places, or even using a fake Venezuelan Tren de Aragua predatory incursion as pretext to relegate brown people to internment camps on the premise that they're all gang members. All these cases will eventually end up before the Supreme Court. And that's why speaking out against emergency docket rulings that have little or no legal explanation is so vital. But I do want to end on an up note, because despite the oligarchs on the Supreme Court, there is an aspect of the judicial system that seems to be working well. It's easy to feel totally at the mercy of the judicial branch, but there is a guardrail that's wholly controlled by we the people, the jury. Whether it's a federal grand jury or a petit jury of 12 citizens at trial, we, the people, have a direct role in the administration of justice, and we're using it. When Trump was arguing for absolute immunity in front of the Supreme Court, trying to get them to crown him king, he argued that without immunity, an army of rogue prosecutors will come out of the woodwork and weaponize the Justice Department with endless indictments against me, your favorite president, and other presidents, making it impossible for us to do our jobs under the Constitution. Now, Justice Sotomayor reminded Trump in that oral argument that we have plenty of guardrails in place to prevent rogue prosecutions. It's called due process, bro. There's a federal grand jury, pre-trial motions to dismiss. You can dismiss a case based on vindictive and selective prosecution. There's the trial itself with all the rules and all the evidence that comes with it. And then there's the trial jury, where all 12 people have to unanimously agree that you're guilty. And after that, there's the whole appeals process that could take years. There's no need to grant anyone absolute immunity because these protections against rogue prosecutions already exist. Now, of course, the Supreme Court disagreed and placed Trump above the law. But now that Trump is in office and he has been the one weaponizing the Justice Department and deploying rogue prosecutors to go after his political enemies, some of those guardrails are holding. In the past week or so, multiple federal grand juries have refused to indict people brought up on ridiculous, trumped-up charges of assaulting federal law enforcement or threatening the president. Whether we, the people, are refusing to indict these guys because the charges are ridiculous or because folks just feel that throwing a sandwich at a cop is awesome, Judge Box of Wine, Jeanine Pirro, cannot seem to get the grand juries to return indictments. The same thing happened in Los Angeles when Trump and his ICE officers and the military accused peaceful protesters of being violent, riotous domestic terrorists that would have burned LA to the ground were it not for him. But federal grand juries said nope. Truly embarrassing for federal prosecutors to fail to indict a ham sandwich. An idiom, by the way, that Justice Alito himself cited during the immunity arguments as a reason that the president needed protection from rogue prosecutors because of how easy it is to get a federal grand jury to indict. So, we the people have news for the ruling class. Federal grand juries are composed of we the people. Democrats, women, LGBTQ+, brown and black people, transgender people, disabled people, people you're throwing off health care, small business owners impacted by your tariffs, sexual assault survivors, members of communities you're ripping apart with masked agents in unmarked vans. We're the members of federal grand juries, and you have to go through us first. Everybody, thanks for watching this first episode. I'm Allison Gill. We will see you next week on The Breakdown.
Love this video? Support independent media and unlock exclusive content, ad-free videos, and custom emojis by becoming a paid member of our YouTube channel today. You can also gift memberships to others. Let's keep growing together.